Companies that invest in intellectual property are simply undervalued.
These companies don't really have a way to present the value of that particular asset to investors.
Our business was not technologically enabled until advances in AI and advances in blockchain presented themselves. Prior to IPW, the process involved an incredible amount of human activity, and it was highly inefficient and completely lacked transparency.
That's where what's in AI actually comes in. It starts with being able to analyze these huge amounts of data from these patent information. Once that's done, blockchain as a technology can then allow you to tokenize these patents and make it available in capital markets.
And by the benefit of digital trust and these technologies coming together in one, we create a much more efficient marketplace.
And that's good for companies, that's good for society, that's good for all of us.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good middle of the night, wherever you are. Welcome back to Hyperledger Global Forum 2021. This is the third day. I hope you've been able to enjoy much of the terrific content here. I get to meet other people. A lot of fun stuff has been happening these last few days, and I'm so excited to introduce and host this final round of keynote conversations and presentations. As usual, and once again, thank you to Accenture and IBM as diamond sponsors of the event. Thank you as well to the Filecoin Foundation, Hitachi, Siemens, and Zuellig Pharmaceutical for their generous sponsorship, which has helped make all of this possible for us to bring to all of you. Also, of course, wanted to reinforce we are governed here by a code of conduct. So please read this, get to understand it. And we really want to make sure that at events like these, whether they're real or virtual, all feel truly welcome here in the Hyperledger community. Hopefully, many of you have had a chance to enjoy the hallway track that we've hosted in Gathertown. A bunch of us gathered there yesterday after the sessions were over and hung out and even played a competitive game of Tetris that was pretty hysterically fun. So I do get a chance to check it out. We'll keep it open a little bit after this last round of sessions is done for today. I do want to express sincere thanks to the program committee, a group of over 20 different individuals drawn from all parts of the Hyperledger community who really helped us put together an amazing forum for all of you. This is community built, community stewarded, and really, I think, reflects the incredible range of ideas and projects going on inside the Hyperledger ecosystem. We also, as you probably saw in the crawl at the beginning, wanted to express sincere thanks as staff to a particular set of individuals in the Hyperledger community who've really helped us glue everything together. Anita and Alexander, Grace Hartley, Bobby Muscara, Peter Samagiari, and Renato Teixeira. All of you have really helped us grow the international footprint and really connect far beyond the code to the broader community of Hyperledger. So thank you for that. I wanted to open with a little bit of a framing, not to drill too much into it, but we really have gotten to better understand our community through some deployment of statistics tools and others to understand the direction that projects head in and that sort of thing. And without diving into it too deeply, one thing that's come back to us pretty clearly is we really do need to figure out, as we've always tried to figure out, how do we work better together as a greenhouse? All of you have seen that graphic with all of our projects together, living under one roof. Some of them intensely competitive with each other, right? Let's just be honest. And sometimes figuring out how to go beyond meeting our immediate needs on those projects can be a struggle. So to try to put this in perspective, some of you heard me mention on a keynote conversation earlier this week, we raise chickens at my house. This is my daughter holding a chick that's a couple of months old. She has gone on to be a egg-laying hen, producing a couple of eggs a day for us, actually. And so I read this passage recently in a newsletter from O'Reilly that caused me to make a connection here. I just really wanted to share with you. And the headline was, is there such a thing as too much competition? And without going into the details, there was this famous chicken breeding experiment where they tried to see how do we increase the amount of eggs that hens can produce in a big, factory farming kind of situation. And so they put all the hens who produce the most eggs together and tried to breed them together, as you might, and discovered that actually it wasn't a great thing. They were producing hens that saw higher aggression, lower egg production, fewer chickens overall due to hyper aggressive hens. By contrast, when they focused their breeding on the most productive groups of chickens, because chickens tend to form flocks, as you might imagine, and bred those for productivity as a group, they saw a 160% increase in productivity. They realized that there was a role that even those chickens who weren't laying eggs played in helping foster that development. We even see this ourselves in our own our own hen house, where we see chickens kind of taking turns on the eggs, keeping them warm, all that kind of stuff. So the conclusion from all of this was that selfish individuals outcompete altruistic individuals, right? But altruistic groups outcompete selfish groups. This was an observation based on this and other work that evolutionary biologist David Sloan Wilson arrived at. And this is a really key insight that I think applies not just to chickens, but applies to open source projects, particularly those like Hyperledger, but also like the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, Apache Software Foundation, and others, that within one community, we sometimes can get competitive. We sometimes, have different approaches to solving the same problem, and figuring out how to help each project be successful, but still work together is super hard to do, rather than just viciously competing. I do want to give one quick example of where I think this is working well. Some folks here might have been on the session yesterday talking about the different interoperability initiatives at Hyperledger, both the project Hyperledger Cactus, as well as the two things in labs, Weaver and Yui. Bringing these projects together, especially so early in their effort, has been really important. They all come at it from different angles with a different idea of what the priorities are. Yui, for example, implements something called the IBC, Inter-Blockchain Communications Protocol. But this early on, it's still early enough for each of them to think altruistically about what might they do beyond meeting their own immediate needs to be able to combine their efforts. And this is something we should be thinking more about across the rest of Hyperledger. When we're building these things, it will pay off to think, how do I find other people with a similar problem to my own, help them meet their needs by looking for opportunities for us to collaborate. And so I'm really happy to see that happen, and really want to make sure as a community, we never take the development of open source as a community, not just as code, for granted, that we recognize this is hard work, and there's a bit of sacrifice required to make that happen. But at the end of the day, if we're altruistic, not just as individuals, but as a group, then we'll get to something really better. And this was just a whole series of observations led me to go, I've got to talk about this in front of the audience. And I'm really happy to see so much of this happening inside the Hyperledger ecosystem. So we had some amazing keynotes during the segment one for today. I won't repeat it, but they're up on YouTube already. One on fighting fraud and error in the vaccine supply chain, which is going to be a huge deal this year. Another talking about all sorts of applications for Hyperledger's technologies in the telecom sector, in some major banking environments where $1 trillion trillion renminbi have been transferred over a blockchain-based network in the last year. In the last year. So amazing stuff to hear. But today we've got an amazing set of keynote panels on their way. One by Jonathan Doughton. I'll introduce him just before he comes on, talking about the fight against misinformation. A fireside chat between Marta Belcher of the Filecoin Foundation and Mike Dolan from the Linux Foundation about this moment in time, where we are with the adoption of blockchain technology. And a closing panel, which I'm really excited about, on how NFTs are changing the music and media landscape. And we'll introduce all of them as we get there. But don't forget the hallway track. Don't forget the networking features and hop in. Be sure and claim your $25 Kiva credit as the attendee gift. And finally, consider coming tomorrow to the Firefly at Hyperledger Day. Links to all of the above are in Hopin. And with this, I really want to transition now to Jonathan Doughton. Jonathan is we're really excited to have you here. Jonathan is a fellow at the Stanford Compression Forum and Stanford Center for Blockchain Research, as well as the USC Shoah Foundation. He researches and lectures on applied strategy and policy for the decentralized web. And as a fun fact, he recently wrapped up 6 seasons writing and producing HBO's Emmy Award-winning series, Silicon Valley. Today, he will share how private and public ledgers can take on misinformation and win. Please welcome Jonathan to the stage.
Thanks so much, Brian, for that amazing introduction. And I certainly, my brother-in-law, he raises chickens, so now I have a new fun fact to tell him. So, well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really excited. This is my first time interacting directly with the Hyperledger community, and so I just wanted to say how excited I am to be here, and hope to begin what I anticipate will be a longer conversation with many of you about ways in which we could potentially work together at the Starling Lab. I'm here to talk this morning about a case study that we launched earlier this year, looking at misinformation and trying to link some of the important new prototypes that we've created into the Hyperledger ecosystem. And we learned a lot in that process, so I'm excited to share with you the results. So to begin, I want to talk a little bit about the Starling framework. And this is an initiative that began at the USC Shoah Foundation and Stanford's Department of Electrical Engineering. We are using tools and principles to empower organizations to securely capture and store and verify human history. And that task seems obvious, like who would actually not want to do those types of things? And yet we realize that the human rights community and historians and others that work very passionately to prevent all sorts of conflict, they yet had not fully grasped the power of the decentralized internet. And yet they were the constituency that actually had potentially the most to gain from these tools. And so we set the course to bring in these tools into that community. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the context for our work with this case study. I'm going to show you the prototype that we actually built with Hyperledger, and then talk to you about some of the key learnings that emerged from that. So to begin, I want to start off just by giving you a sense of the people that have joined us on this road. The context for this project is that the USC Shoah Foundation, which began 25 years ago, has really been working hard on the prevention of genocide. And their mission began by documenting the testimony of the survivors of the Holocaust, which was started by Steven Spielberg after he made Schindler's List. And then it has expanded to include now 9 genocides that are in their collections. And they also have expanded to then work on contemporary conflicts, both with the rising tide of hate speech and violence, and then also challenges that have emerged with misinformation. They were a great pair to then bring in with Stanford's Department of Electrical Engineering, which has a long history of working on innovation, and has also now spent extra effort in the last couple of years working on ethics and how those could be brought directly into code. And so with a host of industry partners, we began with one photograph. This was taken on January 20th, 2017. It was published at 2:02 p.m. on the Reuters Newswire. And it was meant to be a fairly unremarkable statement of fact, which was, here was the inauguration of Donald Trump happening at 12:01. And 8 years before that, the same vantage point taken from the Washington Monument of the inauguration of President Barack Obama. And what should have been very clear and precise documentation of that day instead turned into somewhat of a circus, as you had the politicalization of this photograph really take off to spark a debate about trust in our media. And here, the dispute was that if you looked at other photographs that were presented by people with different political viewpoints, or indeed the administration, they believed in which the other photographs that were not theirs were intentionally framed to show a smaller crowd. And indeed, from their view, the alternative facts, as they called it, was that this crowd that they saw was in fact the largest in history for a presidential inauguration. Now, far be it from me to get into the politics of this, but I think when you look at the specifics around what this meant for the news media, specifically with our partners at Reuters, this was obviously a very disquieting trend, because certainly their photographers were there with the intention of being objective and simply documenting what was going on as a wire service. And so as we got to thinking about it, we started to say, well, how could we use new tools and technologies to secure from capture and then in storage, and then finally through a process of verification, which all news organizations go through, how could we use new cryptographic tools to create what we thought of as an end-to-end signal flow? And what that meant was that we were going to use open source tools, create a root of trust in hardware, use some of the new great Web3 technologies that are here and ready to take on this type of challenge. And then, of course, to keep this entire framework decentralized. So let me show you a little bit about how we put together this prototype. So we started off with a mobile phone that has on it a couple of new features, but for the majority of new smartphones, they actually share the majority of these capabilities. And really, we know them well. So things like GPS and radio signals and the gyroscope and time of date, those are now things that are easy to establish on a mobile phone. And what we can do is we can take that metadata and we can pair it with every photo that comes in off of the camera sensor. And so now the pairing of both the photograph and the metadata can be hashed. It can then be then signed on things like secure enclaves, which are available on most new mobile phones. And with that, you now have a secure file and hash. So what we then did is we took a unique content identifier, a CID, on that record, both again, the pixels as well as the metadata, and we distributed it. And we put it on a distributed storage system that allowed us to put it in a variety of different environments, be it on the for-profit cloud, the nonprofit cloud, education environments, even things like Raspberry Pis. We found ways of disseminating that information. And then using advanced cryptographic proofs, such as Filecoin, we're able to create proofs of space-time that every day we're able to prove that the image had not been manipulated in the object storage. And the network that was underwriting all of this was decentralized. And so really the learnings there is that as you continue to decentralize this work, the more people that join and the more people that are able to join that network, the more secure that network is. So then we continued on to do our expert review. And this is a really important step. And this is where Hyperledger comes in. So and to put it out there on a database which in this case was underwritten by Hyperledger. And it allowed us to take, think of it as almost middleware. We're able to take that information and then start to disseminate it more broadly. The metadata was then put onto a public ledger, which in this case we used the hash graph provided by Hedera. And that seamless integration between Hyperledger and Hedera was something that was really powerful for us to experience, both in this performance as well as the ease in which the technology was put together. And then secondly, we were able to put it on a decentralized cache. And this was really important so that Hyperledger wasn't pinged every time as you needed to verify the information, but instead we could take snapshots of what was in Hyperledger and put it out, not just to any cache, but to a decentralized cache that we built with the GUN database that allowed for rapid performance of this mutable data. And the combination, therefore, of this public ledger that was created by Hedera and the public cache, which was created by GUN, was a really important complement to the Hyperledger solution. And finally, we have here the presentation of this information. And this was essential to figure out a way in which we could allow end consumers to see this. And so we worked with Adobe and their content authenticity initiative to create a way to inject all of this information directly inside of photographs. And so you can see here, the record establishes the photographer, the date, the location, and then we have our signatures coming from Reuters, and of course, our links back to the decentralized web. And what that meant was that now you had in every photograph, not just a collection of the pixels, but it also was a container of all of these additional metadata points and the links back to decentralized web, all contained within the photograph. So to us, what occurred was that, well, that's the ultimate form of decentralization, because now if all of this resides within the object, as the object moves around, no matter where it is, you're able to continually establish that form of credibility. And that authenticity can then be pinged against the various ledgers that are there. And so that was a really powerful example for us. So we put it into action with Reuters. And so the prototype began with work that we did during the California primary, in which we tested out all the technology. And we up-leveled from where we had initially anticipated to actually incorporate a hop from a professional grade DSLR camera to the phone, acting as a notary. And variety of different techniques were explored to secure that link. And what we found then, of course, was that there was from the professional grade camera to the phone, and then finally, we were able to incorporate it directly into the Roy's Newswire's system. And so here you see, this is PhotoWare, which is the tool that they use for their digital asset management. And you can see here that as we looked at this photo, you can click on a tab and you can see all of the keys that were created with Starling. And if I went in as an editor and let's say made a modification to this information, like let's say I was changing a caption, for instance. So if I added that there, which in the case of this demo I'm doing, and we look at the timestamp in which the webhook now pushes out this update to the system, we can now jump into our managed solution for Hyperledger Fabric, which was the IBM blockchain platform. And we can zoom in and we can see seconds later, there it is residing within Hyperledger Fabric. And we can push out now to a Kabuto Explorer, which looks at how this information was then syndicated onto the Hedera hash graph. And indeed, seconds later, there it is again. And we can see that the contents of the information as it exists on the public ledger are encrypted. So we have an ordering system and we've got the marks of authenticity, but yet we retain the security and the encryption on the public network. So a couple of firsts were achieved here. Hardware-based encryption with a solution with the new Canon APIs, the professional grade cameras. We had an end-to-end signal flow built entirely for Web3, a PhotoWare integration, which was the first to Hyperledger Fabric, and really a cryptographic UX, which was pioneered by the folks at Adobe and the New York Times and Twitter with the CAI. So all of that was available to us. And we set out then in our time looking at a second pilot, which was done during the 78 days between the election and the inauguration. And surely, I don't think anyone could have anticipated sitting there on January 20th of this year. No one could have anticipated what had happened in the days leading up to that inauguration. And surely, no matter what side of the aisle that you sit on, the events that occurred on the 6th of January, among many of the other days during that transition period, are troubling. And specifically, they're troubling because of the attacks that were waged directly on the media. Again, there are reasonable conversations to have about opposing viewpoints about where we are with the state of American politics. But surely we can all agree that the Fourth Estate is critical and that strengthening the work of journalists is something that we should all have common cause to support. And in some ways, if you look at what happened 4 years before, I think you can draw some pretty straight lines between the types of virulence and questioning of the media and ask ourselves, like, is there a better way? Is there a way potentially that as we built with an archive, we could start to use digital tools to help restore trust, not to tear down trust? And so that's precisely what you can see with the prototype's final result, which is this archive available on our website. And what you'll see there are the immutable records of those 78 days, the photographs which document them, and now let's come to our learnings. You know, we learned a lot with what happened during that time. And certainly, if you look at even the removal of Donald Trump from Twitter, which happened during those 78 days, it unveils like both the possibility of potentially restoring civics and thinking about responsibilities with online platforms. And then the flip side of that coin is it also revealed the centralized control that exists within those platforms. And certainly there is a lot to consider here. These are thorny issues. So I want to emerge with some learnings and specifically to put it through the prism of Hyperledger Fabric. So first, when we take a look at what we learned in terms of the technology stack, there's some really important lessons here about how things had to come together. Because really, what we learned is that we had a lot of hashes that we had to deal with. Hashes that were coming directly from the authentication at source with the cameras, hashes that came every 24 hours that were coming out of protocols like Filecoin. And then we have all the hashes that were coming out of each transaction that occurred every time someone verified things. And what we needed was a solution that could take the hashes and all the cryptographic integrity and link it back to the object, to the photo itself. And what better way to do that than using Hyperledger Fabric? Because the advantage is that you could actually maintain the principle of decentralization as you were creating those intelligent links. And you could have, therefore, an end-to-end system which had decentralization and intelligence, that you could link all these various forms of decentralizations together, but you maintained the maximum amount of control. Because what was special about the Hyperledger Fabric solution was that you could establish peers to use for maximum flexibility to establish a zone of trust. And therefore, the hybrid approach that we used here of using both permissioned and permissionless systems with public and private ledgers really allowed us to maintain, for the long term, the choice to expand our zones of trust from internal peers that could exist within Reuters, and then as they felt comfortable, to expand things to external peers. And that is the essence of actually a solution that you can use to fight misinformation. And why I say that is because this process of creating an entire web of knowledge around each photograph can really only happen if you're able to make the choices with those peers and to start to bring more and more people into that process. So examples of those types of peers could include the Pointer International Fact-Checking Network, which can help establish all the work that it's doing to validate information as it comes in. It could be standards organization like Claim Review Project, or the work that's being done over at the C2PA, which is being very proudly taken on by the Linux Foundation, which is working on standards essentially for authentication. And when you think about really how to add all this up, what this allows is for a system for individual creators to go and do their own fact checking, and not to centralize all of that work and all of that authenticity onto one single ledger. I mean, that would be a horrible Orwellian result in having some sort of ledger of truth that's out there. But instead, with solutions like Hyperledger Fabric, what you're able to achieve is that every organization can maintain its own ledger, establish the peers in which the zones of trust that it believes it can successfully maintain, and then the collection and the interoperability of all of that information. Well, that's truly what the solution is in creating overwhelming amounts of information that can create confidence. I'm not sure if these videos are playing, so I'm going to go ahead and proceed, but I just want to conclude with some ideas here about our sense of responsibility within the community, because I think this is oftentimes really lost in these technology discussions. I think there's a shorthand now within the blockchain community in which consensus is somehow equated to automation, right? If you look at even like DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations, right? We're blending this idea that somehow creating consensus is obviously enabled by cryptography, and then somehow through the goal of creating more and more automated processes, maybe the entire thing is somehow autonomous in itself. And I don't think that's true. I think that's actually a very problematic approach to consensus, because really when you think about it, consensus requires a lot more work. It requires things like communication. It requires things like choice, so that you can choose to bring your information wherever you so choose. And finally, it requires community, in which we can establish a set of common values. And maybe in aggregate, we might be actually quite diverse and maybe not agree on all things, but there could be ways of establishing consensus that eventually contribute to larger forms of consensus. And that really then underpins the ability to create trust. Because without all of these other activities, it doesn't matter how much automation you have, you're gonna still have disputes. Humans are involved in this process. It's a messy process. And so we as a community need tools that can enable these forms of communication and choice and community. And that is not a theoretical debate. I think when you look at the 20 years of success that's existed within the open source community, we can say this is exactly what is needed to create successful open source projects. One of my favorite papers that really discussed all this was put out by the Mozilla Foundation. It's great bedside reading, as I like to joke. I mean, it's quite dense. But honestly, if you haven't read it, it's worth it. And this talks about frameworks for open source governance and archetypes that exist within the open source community. And I think the blockchain world has a lot to learn from the last 20 years of how open source communities have actually done their work to create various goals of open source creation, how they actually formed those communities and how they've governed them. And it's also revealed that there is still so much work to do. Even 20 years later, open source has not just been the silver bullet to solve everything, just the same way that decentralization is not going to be some sort of panacea. Algorithmic bias, privacy issues, the need for human intervention, the challenges of private platforms, and then finally, of course, diversity. None of those things are solved on their own. and look at the open source community as an example. There's still so much work to be done to create diversity and inclusion within that community. You can see here by the stats, even though the majority of people within the community believe it is inviting, and I think that ethos is important and important to cherish. The numbers tell a different story, which just should really be an inspiration for all of us to bring more into this tent. So in short, that's the reason for creating multiple ledgers and links between them, is that really you want, from a security standpoint, these diverse cryptographic features. You want the performance characteristics that can come by using different types of chains, which each have their own sweet spot within creating trust. And that can allow, therefore, for diverse methods of preservation. And finally, of course, diverse views, because that indeed is the solution to fighting misinformation, is that if we can bring overwhelming amounts of evidence from the most diverse views, that's the best chance that we had in creating real and lasting consensus about how we all want to be part of this society. And of course, strengthening journalism, which, as I mentioned, is truly something none of us should take for granted. So with that, I'll pause here and turn it back over to Brian.
Thank you, Jonathan. Stick around. There were a few questions asked in the community, so I just wanted to get to one of them was the public blockchains that you're using as the other side of this. Could you mention which protocols those are?
Yeah. So in this case, we were using out of Hyperledger Fabric the Hedera Hashgraph and Filecoin as the two main chains. We also did some experiments with IOTA and Ethereum as well, but they weren't included as part of this prototype. But we're big fans of a lot of these different projects.
Yeah. And it sounds like you're using IPFS in there as well. If
yes.
You're using Filecoin. Okay.
Yeah.
So what happens if, and this was another question that was asked, there's kind of a GDPR kind of request to have some content deleted from one of these. How does that affect your use of these technologies?
So when you look at some of the authorities on archiving in the European Union, which is obviously subject to GDPR, there is a big difference between the destruction of information and the availability of information. So the GDPR mandates is really that there is choice for the end consumer, but within responsible archiving work, there are still rights that are afforded to archivists to keep that information as they see it fit for historical preservation reasons or other mandates such as journalism. And so we've been looking at those issues and trying to understand how that's possible to both continue with some forms of persistent storage. The persistent hashes of that storage are also very valuable, as in how different choices are made, let's say in the future, to maybe bring back information into the public fold, into the public sphere. You can then still have those public forms of authentication. So those are important to keep around. But as I think the questioner is signaling, these are by no means easy issues, and therefore they require for all of these protocols to take some measures to be able to both add information as well as remove references to that information in a responsible way. And I think specifically with the distributed storage techniques that we were using with content addressing and IPFS and cryptographic storage with Filecoin, they have large teams that are at work on thinking about accountability, both at the technical and ethical level.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate the time you've been able to spend with us, allowing us to deep dive into this. I also really appreciated your mention of being able to remember, or the importance of remembering the role of humans in the governance of these systems and the design of these applications. I'm definitely on Team Human myself, as I've said another time this conference. So once again, thank you, Jonathan. And let's shift gears now to the next topic. And here I'm really excited to introduce our next two guests. They are Marta Belcher, who is General Counsel and Head of Policy at Protocol Labs. She's also the board chair of the Filecoin Foundation and the Filecoin Foundation for the Decentralized Web. Marta is a pioneer in cryptocurrency law, and she has spoken on this topic around the world, including testifying to Congress, to the European Parliament, to the New York Senate, the OECD, and in Davos during the World Economic Forum. And joining Marta, we have Mike Dolan, the VP of Strategic Programs supporting open source projects and legal programs at the Linux Foundation. Today, they'll be discussing the work of the Filecoin Foundation in helping really figure out how to reinvent how decentralized storage might work through the use of IPFS, like we just talked about, through other types of distributed web, decentralized web kinds of technologies. And really, is there a moment in time now that's similar to the moment in time earlier with open source software where it kind of cross this chasm, to paraphrase the common trope, from kind of activist, researcher, kind of intuitive kind of technologies that came from kind of the true believer set to something that became a part of the underlying foundation for how the world works. And so with that, I can't think of two better people to talk about this than Michael and Marta. Okay. And I think we might be waiting for Mike to start his camera. I don't know if he got pulled away. Is he there?
I can see myself on the camera.
Perfect.
So,
okay, we can see you now too. Take it away.
Thanks for the introductions, Brian. And Marta, thanks for joining us. I appreciate you taking time out to talk to us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. And Brian already did a generous introduction, so I don't think I need to explain any more about what you do or who you are at this point. But maybe what you could do is start us off by talking a little bit about Filecoin Foundation and what you're trying to do with Filecoin and what challenges it's intended to solve.
Sure, absolutely. Well, in short, we're working to preserve humanity's most important information. And I think the best way to think about Filecoin and the problems that we're trying to solve is really to think a little bit about today's internet and its vulnerabilities. So just as one perfectly timed example, on Tuesday, there were dozens of websites around the world that went offline for an hour because of an internal glitch at a major cloud service provider. So you had the UK government's main public service portal down. You had CNN down, the New York Times down. And this is just the latest example of how the internet's centralized model creates these single points of failure. And that's really concerning when you think about the fact that file storage right now is basically a monopoly. So much of today's internet relies on just a few players to store and serve billions of websites and applications. And so backing up a little further, on today's internet, if I go to a web page, that's information that's being retrieved from a particular server somewhere in the world, maybe really far away from me. And I'm looking for that particular web page in a particular place, and I'm hoping that it's still in that place. So it's sort of like, imagine you just read a really good book and you recommend it to your friend, but instead of telling them the name of the book, you say where it is. So you say, well, it's at the New York Public Library and it's the third shelf from the left and it's 5 books over. And that's basically how today's internet works. So in order to go get that book, you have to fly to New York and you have to go to the public library and you have to find the place on the shelf where that book is supposed to be. But maybe it's not there. Maybe someone moved it or tore out pages, right? Or maybe you'll get there and you'll realize you actually had the book in your backpack the whole time. And again, that's today's internet. And so it really just makes a lot more sense to tell your friend the name of the book that you just read and let your friend find that book by its name rather than its location. And so that's what IPFS, the Interplanetary File System, does. So instead of retrieving content by where it is, it retrieves the content by what it is using something called content addressing. So content is addressed using cryptographic hashes instead of by reference to a particular location on a particular server, which means that you don't need a web address to find your file. You just need to know its content address. And if you have it or someone near you has it, you can retrieve it from there. So that's IPFS, and Filecoin builds on top of that. It adds an incentive layer, incentive mechanisms, which I think are a foundational technology for the decentralized web. So some people think of Filecoin like Airbnb for file storage. So miners can rent out their storage space and then earn Filecoin for doing that. And users can spend Filecoin to store files. So really intended to be an incentive layer for the decentralized web. And at the Filecoin Foundation, we're here to create a decentralized, efficient, and robust foundation for humanities information using the Filecoin network. So that's what we're doing at the foundation.
So storing, humanities content in terms of, some of our most important things, that sounds like there's a lot of challenges there. I mean, so, there's a lot of reasons for doing this, I assume, and there's probably some risks of building on or using a decentralized web infrastructure. Can you maybe explain to me sort of the pros and cons in terms of why someone would do this, or maybe some of the potential risks that might come up?
Yeah, absolutely. So with IPFS, anyone can store information, but if someone's serving the only copy of a file and they close their computer and go offline for a few days, that file isn't available anymore. Until they reopen their computer, that file is offline. And so that's definitely an issue with the decentralized web, right? You're not paying some centralized person to store that file. And so you need a way to make sure that that data persists. And so that is the problem that Filecoin is solving. You actually basically are able to pay people to make sure that there are multiple copies and to make sure that someone is always incentivized to make that data available. And it really solves the issue of, if there's no central corporation for you to pay to host your website or your data, who is going to host it? Who's really going to take on the infrastructure cost that it takes to basically reconstitute the web? And so for us, Filecoin is really addressing one of the major problems of the decentralized web.
Okay. So, I mean, it makes me think back though, when we've been talking about IPFS for a number of years now at this point. It sounds like there's an evolution in terms of, a layer above IPFS now with Filecoin, where you can extract more value out of the system by, providing some incentive and reward models. I think back to, open source when things really took off in the late 90s, early 2000s, there tended to be these economic and competitive drivers. No one company could hire all the talented kernel developers in the world. And so the Linux kernel community became this place where a lot of that type of innovation started, in my opinion. There's other open source projects out there, maybe some driven by companies, but to have a true sort of community model led to this faster time to market, faster integration with end users getting involved. But we've been on this, as the Linux Foundation, we've observed this sort of multi-decade shift towards end user driven innovation, and the ability of open source as a forum or a place for end users to collaborate with companies, vendors, others around the world who have the same types of problems. As you look at IPFS, you look at what you're doing with Filecoin, it looks like you're kind of an evolution of something similar to what we saw in the early days of open source. Is that your feeling? Where do you think you're at in sort of that arc or trajectory around storing content?
Yeah, I think that is a perfect parallel. I think that's exactly right. And we are finding ourselves in that moment. So we launched the Filecoin network back in mid-October of this past year. And it has scaled so incredibly quickly. We're now over 6 exabytes of storage capacity on the network, which is frankly staggering and not beyond what I think we could have expected. And I think it's in part driven by the fact that, well, several things. I mean, one thing I should say is Filecoin is, of course, completely open source. And so it's really important to us that we have literally thousands of people in the world participating and making this into a worldwide decentralized storage network. And then I think there are some other things at play as well. So one of the things that happens with Filecoin is you create this data storage marketplace, this really dynamic marketplace where you're doing storage deals. And I think just from an economic perspective, it turns out that pencils out pretty well. And so we're seeing a lot of applications being built on top of Filecoin, and we have a really impressive and very fast growing ecosystem of literally hundreds of organizations that are collaborating on the Filecoin network and building applications and developer tooling and infrastructure and more. And that certainly would not be the case, in my view, if we were not fully open source and really committed to the open source community. And of course, just as one example, we just heard from Jonathan Doughton, and Jonathan's Starling project has been building on top of IPFS and Filecoin, and really, I mean, he as you heard, he's creating the ability to authenticate and store some of humanity's most sensitive and important digital records. So, genocide testimony and documentation about human rights violations. And he's really using the Filecoin network to store humanity's most important information, which is really aligned with our mission. And he's just one of many, many people who is building on top of the Filecoin network.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting when you think about it, in terms of, genocide data, some of these important sensitive documents, but, even, it layers lower in terms of critical importance to the history of the world or humanity. We have practical things. I think of, back, I think it was in 2013, Jonathan Zittrain and Kendra Albert from Harvard, they were making headlines, pointing out that roughly half of the URLs cited in US Supreme Court decisions linked to nowhere on the internet because the URLs had changed or the content had been moved. So it sounds like Filecoin could potentially help with these types of problems. Is that an appropriate way to frame it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that link rot is a really serious threat to data on the web. And, they've just updated that research and looked at links in the New York Times articles and found that more than a quarter of the deep links are actually now no longer working. And so you have completely inaccessible pages when you have links in the New York Times. And so if you look at how Filecoin could play a role in that, the issue here is you have these particular URLs pointing to a particular server somewhere in the world. And if instead of doing that, you're pointing to a particular content ID, you can retrieve that as long as there are still copies anywhere. As long as someone somewhere is storing it, IPFS solves that problem. And then if you really want to make sure that data persists, you can pay using Filecoin to make sure that it does persist and to make sure that that data is continuing to exist on the network. And if you have things like Supreme Court decisions or New York Times articles, I mean, anyone can pay to make sure that those things are stored in perpetuity and to make sure that that data is persisting. And so one example of another organization that's working really hard on that is the Internet Archive, which is, of course, preserving the web and trying to foster the web's future by making sure that it's preserved. And one of the things they're doing is storing some of their data on the Filecoin network in the Filecoin Archives project. So similarly, taking the web and putting it onto, making sure that it'll persist by putting it onto the Filecoin network.
Yeah. It also makes me think, like, in the early days of open source adoption, we had sort of this movement around open source. There was kind of this like moral underpinning in terms of, opening up the code that we were all dependent upon and using and being able to make it accessible to anybody. And then there was sort of this practical debate that happened, after enterprises and large companies and vendors started leeching onto this and saying, hey, we could actually work in this community too, and we could build a product or solution around it. And sort of, open source grew up in some ways, and there was this sort of professionalization around it. And I'm wondering, are you seeing, similar types of tensions? Because, at that time there was some tension, as some people who had started off some of these projects or gotten involved for certain reasons, now you have all these companies potentially involved who are interested in, maybe making use of this for real practical applications where they can do content storage in a decentralized model. Are you seeing any sort of this, innovator's dilemma where you started off with one group and now, you're shifting in terms of, making this available as part of a solution or something in an enterprise context?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we're definitely building on the shoulders of giants here, in terms of, the ability for open source code to be used in enterprise, and we are fully open source, and Filecoin has been great for enterprise. I think it's because it's a really compelling alternative to these traditional centralized storage intermediaries, and not only do you have the sort of story around the decentralized web and the narrative and the way that it addresses the issues with the centralized web, but it's also, I think, very compelling economically, because we have these dynamic markets. The Filecoin marketplace is a very dynamic market for data storage. And so I think enterprises are really picking up on that. And so, that includes obviously file storage, securing large data sets, and also verifying data, which is a whole, as we heard from Jonathan Doughton earlier, which is a whole new, really important area. And it really allows people to develop self-publishing alternatives, for example. Just to give you a few examples, we have something called Slate that is building on top of Filecoin. That's basically like Dropbox for Filecoin. Makes it really easy to store your files as an individual user, built on top of Filecoin. We have something called Fleek building on top of us, which lets you build websites and apps which are stored on the Filecoin network and built in a way that's permissionless and trustless and free of centralized gatekeepers. So I would say, I think there's a lot of enterprise adoption, and I think there's a lot more in the foreseeable future. We're really starting to see things tip in that regard.
And I think we only have a few minutes remaining here, so I'll maybe leave on a question of, how does somebody get started with Filecoin? How do you start, using it or participating? Or if you're a company, how do you start engaging as someone who's building a solution on it?
Well, one of the things that's so great is that we are fully open source, so it's actually very easy to engage with us and our code, and you don't even have to interact with humans if you don't want to. But if you don't mind interacting with humans, one of the things that the foundation is doing is really trying to build our ecosystem, and make sure that we're spurring growth in the Filecoin ecosystem. So we have all sorts of developer grants, and other grants that are available. We have lots of events and hackathons, and we're really trying to invest in the ecosystem and make sure that it takes off in the way that it can. So lots of opportunities if you're building on top of Filecoin or interested in building on top of Filecoin, to work with the Filecoin Foundation to do that.
Sounds good. Well, Marta, I appreciate you joining us today, and thank you and all of the developers and those involved in Filecoin and IPFS for enabling an infrastructure that I think could potentially help solve challenges around preserving some of the most important content that we have, whether it be, genocidal records or even Supreme Court case links, which I know many attorneys in our ecosystem would like to have more readily available. So thank you very much for your help, and Brian, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you both. That was such a fascinating dive into distributed storage and this moment that we're in, I think. So now I'd like to close the panel, close the keynotes with an amazing panel. We are here to really focus on this question of, we've heard a lot about NFTs, we've heard a lot about the potential to generate some interesting amounts of money for artists who are long overdue for that kind of outcome. But I think there's really a moment in time we are at here with the underlying technology to fix some structural issues with connecting artists to audiences, and trying to really reformat how a lot of that industry works through this technology. And we're joined by a couple of people who've been thinking hard about this for a very long time. I'll introduce them quickly, and then I'll hand the mic over. But coming up on stage, we will have to host this panel on our NFTs changing the music music and media landscape, Daniel Heyman, who's co-founder and CEO of Palm NFT Studio, Brandon Cooper, who's the director for NFT, blockchain, and digital systems at Panini America, the incomparable Imogene Heap, who's a musician, obviously, and founder of the Creative Passport. And the panel will be moderated by David McFadden, who is professor of music at UCLA and chair of the Media and Entertainment SIG at Hyperledger. So with that, please help me welcome the panel to the stage. Hello. I think we're still waiting for Daniel to show. Oh, no, Daniel's there. Okay, great. And David, there we go.
Hi, everyone.
Great to see everybody here. Thanks very much, Brian, for that introduction. So today's format will be, I think, maximally informal. There's no need for us to observe a dusty procedure here. So if we could just start with a general introductory question, which is, given the enormous journalistic and public and financial interest in NFTs over the last half a year or so, how exactly have they impacted your work?
Shall I begin?
Oh, absolutely,
Sure.
Please. Yeah, let's let inspiration dictate the passage of events.
Well, I have done this really as an experiment to see what's out there, what does it mean for me as an artist, what could it mean for us in the future as musicians. So I released a few, a kind of bundle of them. They went up about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and a few of them are sold and a couple of them haven't. It was really insightful just to understand the space and how actually really complex it is and how it's changing every single day, and how even I, Imogen Heap, early interests in blockchain, still found it really hard to sell my NFTs. You really have to be in amongst it and really kind of live and breathe it. But for me, what it's changed is my imagination of how I could create music in the future, not just like song format, but in kind of short form, something kind of more bite-sized, manageable chunks for me, especially as a mother and kind of doing a lot of things. I'm quite excited about the idea that there is no kind of template right now. It can literally be an idea for a song or a few lyrics here or something over here. It's very undefined, and I really like that play space. It doesn't kind of block us in. So that's what's exciting about it for me right now.
How about you, Dan?
In the last 6 months, I guess I left my job and started a new business all around NFTs. So it's impacted me significantly, I think it's fair to say. I think it's incredible the way there's this groundswell of enthusiasm, and blockchain has sort of managed to cross into the public attention in a way it's never actually succeeded in doing so before through NFTs. Blockchain primarily has been used for decentralized finance, experimentation, and that's a huge market and very exciting. But NFTs represent all things, all assets, all media, all creativity, and that's so much bigger of a market. And to see the potential and experimentation and creativity that Imogen was talking about unleashed in those various fields, it's been wild and fun.
Maybe this would be the point, just to get a little bit of context on Palm. Would you like to explain the background to the project?
Yeah, sure. So by way of my personal background, I spent the last 3.5-ish years leading the protocol engineering group at Consensus. And so we're very close to the Hyperledger Foundation. For example, we contributed Hyperledger Besu and sort of have a couple members in my team or former team on the technical steering committee. What I realized as the NFT craze was exploding is that a lot of the technology we had already built with Hyperledger Besu for enterprises like JPMorgan Chase or UBS or MasterCard could solve a lot of the challenges that NFTs have on mainnet Ethereum. And so in partnership with some amazing creative partners and Consensus as a technical partner, we decided to launch Palm as an NFT optimized chain inside the Ethereum ecosystem that's sort of scalable, low gas, high throughput, and really optimized for creators and rewarding creators. Then Palm NFT Studio on top of that is basically the name suggests, a creative studio to help and partner with creators, brands, content owners, and so forth to land in BOM.
Actually, on that note of collaboration, Imogen, is this, given your own personal interest, have you noticed much collaboration or cooperation between musicians, or do you find yourself as sort of a solo point of energy and enthusiasm?
No, I found a lot of collaborations in the music space around this. I mean, even just on my own personal little NFT that I released, it was musicians who were supporting me to do that. There doesn't seem to be competition in the same way. I think there's this feeling that, you know, there's just so much opportunity and it's fun. This kind of idea of pipping each other up against each other just doesn't seem to exist in this space. So actually Don Diablo, he's a very successful musician, DJ, and he has, I mean, he's done amazingly well with his NFTs, and he's spent a whole year creating these amazing pieces, so fair enough. But he bought my first one, and there may be a collaboration in that in itself, you know, that he takes a little piece of this idea, because it's a kind of 7-second looped piece of music of an idea, of a cappella piece. So he's inspired to take that on. So it's kind of interesting to discuss, what is the IP in this NFT, or was it there at all? So it's it's really exciting to be able to have those discussions openly right now, because none of these things are defined. So it's good to work with people, and we have to do it, because otherwise, you know, there's going to be this, people are going to come in like publishers and labels, and they're all going to try and get a piece of it and not really understand. We're not going to have a chance to let it have its full potential. So I think it's really important that musicians get in. Even now it's a bit confusing, just to explore and kind of have a bit of fun with it.
And when it comes to audio in particular, what have you found, or what do you think might be the most successful marriage of different art forms? Would it be audio with a video loop, or audio with a static image? What strikes you as maybe the most promising combination of audio with another form of expression?
I mean, some of the most beautiful ones I've seen are Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst have released some absolutely beautiful on Foundation, I think. I mean, that just seems like the perfect kind of, to me anyway, I would like to buy them if they've gone up way too much for me. But just the way that all the technology is integrated, and the AI and all the projects that they have, it just feels like a beautiful kind of, it feels like the perfect place. It wouldn't exist if it wasn't for NFTs, and it feels like this new art forms are being born like every day. So I don't know, I feel like not putting it into a box, because it seems like that box is just kind of being already out of shape by just saying one thing. But I really love, you know, some of the just simple photography is just really beautiful, kind of parallax photography of nature. Or it's, what I love about it is it's about these NFTs, they feel more like about a moment in time. They're like encapsulating a moment, which is something that you can contemplate, rather than music, which on streaming services, it just feels like this kind of endless kind of stream of noise, and, you know, it's kind of in the background, it's not really being paid attention. And this is kind of it feels like the flip of that right now. It feels like people are really paying attention to these quite detailed small pieces, and I think that's really lovely.
And Dan, what have you found it? Because obviously you're showcasing the work of multiple artists. Has there been a particular way in which audio or music has been published?
So we haven't POM launched yet. We actually have some major milestones today and in the coming weeks, which I'll let people who announce these things announce them. But in terms of what I've seen out there, I think my favorite audio project is Euler Beats so far. I think both the way they experimented on generative music, but also experimenting with bonding curves and other crypto native primitives is really cool. Really challenging, really innovative. And I think it sort of speaks to the creativity in the space. But I think there's such a powerful kernel of truth in what Imogen just said about people paying attention to the medium. And I think it's because we have a different relationship to content when we feel like we own it or have a say in the content. The whole rise of streaming has become this one-way flow of content that's really, I think, made the fan sort of peripheral in that process, not a stakeholder, not care as much and therefore not as much of a fan. And NFTs, I think, reshape the relationship between creator and fan and bring them back in to the process by having an ownership stake. And that's really powerful. And I think we're just at the beginning of what that can actually mean.
So ultimately, when one or multiple art forms are put together, one of the appeals of NFTs is that they perhaps become collectibles. And that brings us directly to you, Brendan, because you're in the field of sports collectibles. And because I'm rather familiar with some of your work, I know very well that you take, let's say, the traditional static design of what previously on paper or cardboard would have been a card, a baseball card or a basketball card, but you join it with a little, for example, a little video loop. So given that you're already doing some of the things that we just talked about in the field of music, but in sports, how have NFTs changed your very well-established world of tangible static collectibles?
Well, it's been very exciting. First of all, everyone's talking about them. They kind of dawned on the public consciousness in a really big way in the first quarter of this year. Panini launched its NFT product in January of last year. And it was difficult because we were having to think how to explain an NFT. And then all of a sudden, we no longer have to explain an NFT, at least with respect to collectibles, but certainly lots of questions around what it means to be authentic and what are the actual contractual rights, and is it property and is it not, and is a token good enough, and what all these things mean. But the athletes, the agents, the entertainers that we work with, they've all been hugely interested and motivated in this direction. They see it as a new opportunity. There's lots of different emerging points of distribution. And of course, lots of conversations around royalties and what it means for the creators and the people in the creator communities. As one of the largest licensees in the world, we're really focused on protecting the Panini brand as a 60-year brand, and of course we represent some of the largest licensors in the world, and we're practicing in a 120-year-old collectible category. So we've moved deliberately and slowly. We're actually using the Hyperledger sawtooth technology, and we're really excited about the future of the category and what it means for collecting.
Since two of you have already mentioned Hyperledger, needless to say, the issue of, or the positive issue of blockchain technology lies behind a lot of what we're discussing. So, Brendan, how has the issue of forgeries been addressed, or maybe even just appreciated by your client base? Because when we're talking about, let's say, for example, baseball cards, I mean, for decades there's been an enormous problem with forgeries.
Sure. So, this technology has evolved very quickly, and in fact, it's evolved quicker than the actual adoption of different decentralized identity solutions, for example, and establishing authenticity. So if you have a major company that's representing what they're doing, either on a public or a private blockchain network, that can be a really strong point of authentication. But in the larger world, the larger community of creators, if anyone on the internet can be a dog, well, anyone that's creating NFTs can potentially rip off your work. And so there's some really important work that's ongoing in terms of how to create public registries and certification process for the creators and the content developers, so that you have the strongest authentication possible at the point of creation, when it's actually, when the creator assigns it to a public blockchain, it's connected to the network, that is a strong and perfect bond. And you've got the surety that you need that it's actually either officially licensed or created by the person who's representing it.
And when it comes to creators, actually, that brings us directly back to you, Imogen. One of the things we haven't, well, we've only been here for 10 minutes, but one of the things we haven't yet touched upon is uptake what barriers do you think there have been, or what have the greatest obstacles been to public involvement or uptake? How hard are these things to make for you and your peers?
Yeah. Well, everyone has a different story because there's so many different routes. There's, you know, different markets. You can go your own way and kind of bespoke create your plan. I mean, I really didn't know what I was doing. So I worked with somebody called Sam Parker, who does know the space a bit. And he, after a lot of kind of deliberation and chatting to this other guy, Tim Exile, who we launched it with, this company called Endless, where I made the little pieces on, we decided to go with Cargo to, you know, put all the information, and again, they would go to, what's the name of that thing? Permaweb, Arweave. So they'd be stored on Arweave, and then we would put them up on OpenSea. So we had these 3 different kind of pieces to it. And then it was the metadata, you know, we almost, and in fact, they put it up. And then I was like, wait, we haven't done the metadata yet. They were like, oh yeah. So we had to take them all down again and then go in and make sure that the metadata was perfect, because that's a real opportunity that we don't have in digital distribution a lot of the time, is to be able to explain where it comes from, who did what, how much percentage might be going to a charity, for example. To be able to exhibit that and be connected to that piece is, you know, what I've been dreaming about for music to be for so long, to be able to see the history and all the people involved, that it remains intact. So that's exciting. But yeah, other musicians do it in their own way. And that's the thing, there is no kind of set place. There's like Hickek-Nunk, and there's this thing over here, and if you're lucky you get onto Foundation, and you know, there's so many great places, and I'm sure there's probably like 20 more since I, you know, did my research just 3 weeks ago. So it is a kind of free-for-all right now. There is a misconception that because we only hear about the big sales, that if you put you know, an NFT up, you're going to make tons of money, which is kind of what I thought. But that's not the case. You know, you still need to work it just like anything else out there, and go out and market it. And you know, so the people who are successful are there, who kind of living and breathing it, and they're working the clubhouse rooms, and they're in the community, you know, and rightly so. You can't just swoop in and like suddenly make a bunch of money, just like you can't do in the music industry. You know, you've got to work at it for years, and you've got to get to know your people, and you've got to do your touring. It's not an easy win, but it is a very exciting space, and I do love to share the positivity, because the future is really exciting, and it will become much easier, and there will be services that will take bigger cuts, and it will just make it easy for artists to go up and, you know, put up stuff, and they'll curate it, and you know, so I just hope that there's going to be lots of options. The thing that really does need to happen, as Brendan mentioned, is the identity layer. How do we connect the NFT to the artist or the creator? And how do we enable them to be really searchable across different blockchains, across different services, like a massive marketplace of, you know, every bit of art that could be out there. How do we find them? And for things to be, you know, interoperable and transferable, and so yeah, so much still to do. But and for many artists, I would actually say, if you don't have lots and lots of time, maybe don't go into it right now. But if you're a bit nerdy and you're curious, and you like getting stuck in, then go for it, because we need you.
On the subject of identity and metadata, that's probably a good time to ask you about the Creative Passport. Yeah,
so the Creative Passport really came out of hearing about blockchain for the first time, exactly 6 years ago, actually, in May this year. My friend Zoe Keating told me about blockchain, because I was lamenting about having to like have this song and then upload it, and then none of the data kind of sticks to the song. I'd have to go in and make sure everyone's registered. You can't be sure whether everyone gets paid. And just on discovering really what blockchain and smart contracts and this kind of that world could look like if it was put in the right directions and the pieces were kind of puzzled together correctly, we could have a really fluid, fast, sustainable, transparent, thriving music ecosystem with tons of services, with songs, with all of their data intact on an amazing ledger that can get searched, and anything you want to need to know about those songs, including who to pay, would be agreed by all parties and be able to be seen. And then the identity layer, which I realized was missing from a lot of the services, were kind of building things actually for the major labels, because that's where all the rights are, but not really thinking about how the musicians independently were going to benefit from these features. And I kept hearing about all this service. I'm like, yeah, but how do I get a part of that? And they're like, well, yes, kind of through the labels. We're doing these deals with the labels. And I'm like, no, it's happening again. We're just recreating old problems in a new, amazing possible space. So we started to develop the Creative Passport, which is really a digital identity for music makers. At the moment, it's in beta and it's actually quite static. It just is a knowledge store for your biography, your press picture, your skill sets, your websites, maybe your NFTs, whatever you want to share publicly in one place that you might want to share, kind of like a dashboard, like a patch bay of information that's public and privately permissible, that you can decide, I want this information to be shared with these people and this information not to be shared. So you could have I want my biography to be freely shared across all music services that kind of share our APIs. And then you would have biography and press image always up to date, always exactly as you want it. But equally, if somebody wanted to cross-reference some information about you, they could find it with your skill sets, combined with your passions, combined with your interests, So it's really just a base layer. And at the moment, we're just trying to rally together musicians to understand the importance of data and the value in their data just on its own, ahead of the music. But just get that bit right, get yourself organized, and we can be prepared to allow those services in the future to know that we are who we say we are. I am verified Imogen Heap, and I can start to plumb into these services without them having to do the KYC. So at the moment it's very early stages, but really it's about kind of sharing a vision and trying to get musicians to sign up to actually there's not really very much there, but it's just together we're going to continue to develop this platform, because ultimately it could be that our CEO in a couple of years' time would be the DAO, it'd be a DAO of musicians.
Yes.
So we're just already starting to explore, voting and governance just in a kind of soft way, where we're just about to launch a website where you can just vote basically and suggest changes. I got inspired by seeing the Flamingo DAO app page. So it's just very early stages. We don't have a way to do the KYC in terms of the person. So we do need to work with top layer kind of DID companies. So we've actually been, I've done so many of those. Here's your passport. Yes, I do want this crypto wallet to, basically all that stuff. I've done that so many times. But we know that it's going to become the norm. We're all going to have a digital identity, and then this stuff's going to be way easier. But right now, as Brendan said, we don't have that yet, and that is slowing things down because there's this adoption that has to happen, just like we did credit cards. We now have to have that with digital IDs, and we already have our online banking, and we have our wallets. But why not have a big identity with all the different stuff in your wallets and your health and your creative passport and but we do what we can when we can, and that's what we're doing right now.
So, Brendan, let's say somebody has that metadata in place and they've got a creative passport set up. One of the less familiar issue will be how to get started. And we've just had a question come in from the public through the chat, which is, verbatim, the question is, how can an artist, digital or freehand, get into this? What are the first steps? So if they came to you and your platform, what would you suggest as the best way to get going logically with your own help?
Sure. So with the, most of the major NFT marketplaces have facilities for creators to mint and create NFTs. But that's a little bit different than a turnkey service, kind of what Imogen was saying about, if you have an overall strategy that the people you're going to want to talk to, there are smart people in the community, and you can reach out to different boards and communities connected to the NFTs space, in both on social media and the marketplaces. And they can guide you through it. And so right now you probably need a specialist, but I know for a fact that there are a lot of initiatives to provide turnkey services to creators and artists so that, and those will be emerging in the next few months. There's already some that are out there. I can't represent any at this time, but they're coming. And, you know, in 6 months, certainly this time next year, there's going to be some really sophisticated offerings for a whole suite of different NFT products with established distribution and rates, and hopefully some a DAO ownership or stake. Imogen was talking about the distributed autonomous organizations, because that unleashes the possibility that artists at all scale, both those that are world famous like Imogen and then smaller ones, can all participate in a network without being captive to the established distribution models. And that's kind of the dream.
Absolutely.
So how about you, Dan? I mean, how are you making this process easier? How is Palm going to streamline this and maybe help people who are either a bit nervous or maybe not that gifted technically do what they would like to do with NFTs?
So we operate at 2 layers of the stack. So first, you know, the core, we're plumbers in many ways. We create the infrastructure that enable the tech platforms and the service providers to do the work they do. And so in that capacity, we wouldn't be interacting directly with artists. But we also, through the Creative Studio, partner with creatives. You know, Damien Hirst will be our first project. Obviously, he's an artist of you know, quite high stature in his world, across worlds. But there are other smaller artists we work with. For us, well, we select partners based on a few criteria. Obviously, financial impact is one of them, but we're most excited by artists who have a vision for how to use the technology to push forward their art. You know, a lot of people, I think, just want to take something they're already doing, put it in an NFT and have it sell for bajillions of dollars. And that's not really how the world works. There needs to be a reason and a thought process on what you can do with your art as an NFT that makes it more exciting and compelling as an artistic endeavor. And I think we're just at the beginning of that experimentation on what's possible. So if I were an artist looking to get into this space, I think the first thing is to answer why am I looking to get into this space. I think there's a number of folks who've entered it for purely financial reasons, and you can be quite successful in that regard. But I think just like in most other financial pursuits, you need to build your audience. That doesn't matter the platform in terms of minting your NFT as much as building the community, engaging with the community, and finding your patrons. But then there's a whole set of different artists who really want to experiment with new tools, generative art, collaborative art, artwork, new financial relationships to art, like projects like this art piece is always on sale, or other efforts like that. And those, I would love to chat with you. And I know lots of people who would love to chat with you who are really in this with the creative pursuit.
How, we have time for a couple more questions. How optimistic do the 3 of you feel about this technology as a truly revolutionary potential? Do you think there's much of a risk that ultimately NFTs might be used to recreate or reestablish the current power imbalances in the media or entertainment space?
I am slightly nervous of that, I have to say. That's why it's going to be very hard to do because it's so enormous and fast spreading and there's so many independent people. But I am a bit nervous for the music space that there is a history, shall we say, of the music industry kind of taking a very hard line on things that they don't have control over and that have the potential to, you know, stop the flow of innovation. But there'll always be, I mean, certainly for anyone who's already signed, because they'll be like, oh no, but this is a new format and therefore we need to have our massive chunk of it. So that is, you know, slightly concerning. But there's massive hope, you know, there's such hope. We're so early on in the time, in these days. And, you know, just in a little month of kind of, or month or 2 of exploring this space, my mind has been opened up to new possibilities. I'm feeling, you know, really positive about my own creative output, that I am not limited finally to this, you know, 4-minute chunk, that there's this whole you know, and also the collaboration side of things, you know, how once we will get our identities kind of sorted out and everything's interlinking and nice and smooth, which might take 5 or 10 years. But the idea that, you know, these NFTs might kind of go into virtual worlds and out over here and come out of the radio at this point and then go into that person's wallet, and they skip over a stepping stone in some other program and then it does this, and but everyone's like paid fairly and acknowledged fairly, like all the worlds and all the different mixed media kind of come together. Mixed
Yes.
It's just fluid and awesome. So, and it just felt like it wasn't really going anywhere right now. And then there's all of this explosion of possibility because there's no kind of box yet. So yeah, I'm excited.
That's
oh, sorry, yeah, Brendan, I think I can hear your voice. Please go ahead.
Yes, that's the vision I share. I think Imogen got it. There's a lot of possibilities. You know, everything's built on top of protocols, and I think those, because they're available to everyone, of course, there's always going to be advantages that accrue to some people. But if anyone's trying to extract inordinate rents or excessive economic value from distribution, then that distribution gets to go somewhere else. And that's new. You know, in the past it was a captive model. And so this technology unleashes, in my view, huge new potentials. And the long tail of creators are, I think, and I'm very optimistic about it, are going to get their due. They're going to be able to create their communities, and whether they're global superstars or not, there's going to be a space for them to get economic returns on their creativity and the audiences that they generate. And I'm really optimistic about that.
Would you agree, Dan?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think what's powerful about blockchain for NFTs, for finance across verticals, is not necessarily the elimination of middlemen, the wholesale elimination of middlemen, but rather forcing or requiring that the value that a middleman captures is commensurate to the value they create. And it's
Absolutely.
no longer this disproportionate value just because of their privileged position in the ecosystem.
Yeah.
We have open ecosystems of blockchain. And so I don't know a ton about music studios, that's not my world, but I'm sure they do some valuable things and some extractive things. And in a blockchain future, I hope they continue to do the valuable things and aren't able to do the extractive things just because they no longer have that sort of control.
That's
Well
totally
said.
it. Yeah. I really believe that. We need to kind of make this space, we need to augment the existing system, the existing services, and we need to be able to highlight the good work that they do, and the fat that's there will become apparent, and other things will take their place. And there's nothing like when when certain people understand that, then only good things can happen, because if they want to survive, then they need to play this fair game. So I'm very excited about that. And when we have this kind of essential core protocol layer, where things are able to float between services and everything is kind of clean, there's just going to be a blossoming of new ways to interact with art in such a huge way, and it's going to be so much easier for the users to be able to flow through them and know what they can do with art. So hopefully we never any more questions or emails. Imogen, I want to play this in my wedding, is that okay? I'm like, yes, of course it's okay. Like, people are terrified that they're going to be like hunted down by the police and dragged into jail for playing a piece of music at a wedding. So hopefully it will just be there'll just be a lot more ease of collaboration and genuine kind of goodwill, because nobody's worried, because everybody's credited. I think that often stops people from working together, because they're worried they're not going to get credited, or anyway. So yeah, I'm the same. I'm super positive, as you can tell.
Just to rain on everybody's parade of positivity, I think we might be remiss in the last 120 seconds not to mention energy consumption. Would one of you perhaps like to comment on NFTs and your views about some of the public concern over that issue?
Yeah, so if you don't mind, I'll take that one.
Yeah, please.
So first, this is not a direct answer, but I would love someone to do an analysis on the energy consumption of the traditional financing, the traditional entertainment distribution business, with millions of people going into massive towers every day to make those systems work. It's interesting and hard to compare apples to apples. The numbers are certainly scary when it comes to blockchain. But we already know that systems exist and are continuing to roll out that are many, many orders of magnitude more efficient than the current proof of work standards. Those are coming to the Ethereum ecosystem rather rapidly with Ethereum 2.0. Palm, which will be launching imminently, is sort of 1 million to 10 million times more energy efficient than proof of work systems. So, the first car in 1914 was massively inefficient. They've become more and more efficient over time. I think the impetus and particularly the demands from creators are forcing our industry to prioritize this in a way that maybe it hadn't before, and the solutions are coming to market very quickly. So it's a problem, but one where the technologists have heard and understood the concerns and will make the requisite changes imminently.
Anybody else? 60 seconds, or do we concur completely?
I concur completely. Yeah, I mean, every single blockchain out there needs to be, completely at zero in the future to be able to make it with the public. It's good that there's this massive concern. It's forcing people to get to that place quickly, and those that can't or won't are going to fall off quickly.
Listen, thank you so much for being so wonderfully accurate with your time usage. And with that, and with a deep bow of gratitude to all of our guests, I hand you back to the studio and Brian.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you, Imogene. Thank you, Dan. What a terrific panel. As you can see from looking across today and looking at our keynotes this entire week, our community here at Hyperledger really encompasses not just the big money core infrastructure use cases like supply chains and central bank digital currencies. They also touch on issues like the fight against disinformation and reinventing the music industry. And so thank you to all of you on the panel for making that really come to light. And it's so great that we can be working on technologies like this. So let me pivot now to the close. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Alan.
And once again, thank all of you for joining us here at Hyperledger Global Forum. There's still 4 hours more of sessions and breakouts and interesting things, panels as well. Please join us for those. We also have the Firefly at Hyperledger Day tomorrow, starting at 9 a.m. Eastern time. So I hope you can join us for that. And this crazy ride we've all been on where we've been channeling everything through our Zoom windows and such has allowed us to really reach a global audience, and it's been great. But we're very much hoping to be able to see all of you in person next year as well. So please watch the wires for that and enjoy the remainder of the conference today. See you in 10 minutes at the opening of your favorite breakout. Talk to you all soon.